Good morning. Welcome, everyone. If there are any advocates that would like to come on the steps, we invite you to come forward. All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Good morning. I'm Karen Baker. I'm the CEO of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. And on behalf of PCAR and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I welcome you here today, especially all of the survivors who are the ones who pay the price when our laws aren't strong enough, and all the advocates that are here who help them every day, and all of the legislators and partners who stand here with us today to commit to making positive changes. Welcome all to our annual Advocacy Day. This day is really about all of you. We stand with you so that together we can create a safer Pennsylvania. PCAR and PCADV work with a very strong network of community-based centers throughout the Commonwealth, and they provide help, hope, and healing in all 67 counties, 24 hours a day. PCAR centers provide help to more than 30,000 women, men, and children every year. We also work with news media to help educate the public on issues around sexual assault. And yes, we are also frequent visitors to this illustrious building where we work with legislators to advocate for survivors and push for improved laws. And that's why we're here today. We are in an unprecedented time of attention to the seriousness and pervasiveness of the problem of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. Pennsylvania has seen more victims reaching out in the context of the Me Too movement, the release of the PA grand jury report of clergy abuse, the trial and convictions of Bill Cosby and pediatrician Johnny Bartow, and many other examples of trauma and betrayal. With increased attention to sexual abuse comes an opportunity and responsibility to create real and lasting change. PCAR and PCADV support a number of important bills that are currently under review in the legislature. We have speakers here today who will share details about those bills that we champion. And also today, we have advocates from all over the state and survivors who are meeting with their legislators to carry forward three important messages. Number one, we must criminalize acts of sexual extortion that far too often fall through the cracks of our existing sex crimes. Two, we must establish consistency in sexual assault evidence collection and testing. Excuse me, it shouldn't matter where you live, what kind of services you can get. And three, to meet the increased demand in our communities, we are asking for a 10% increase for all of our centers. This will help them serve all survivors. Excuse me. It is now my privilege to introduce, thank you. It is my privilege to introduce Senator Langerholk, who is the prime sponsor of sexual assault victim rights legislation. Thank you, Senator Langerholk.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here today to both recognize some of the progress we've made in making Pennsylvania safer for victims, but more importantly, to collectively stand here in support to show our commitment to continuing that fight for victims' rights. I prosecuted as an assistant district attorney for nearly 10 years in the Cambria County District Attorney's Office. It was this time as a prosecutor that gave me firsthand experience into what victims go through as they navigate the criminal justice system. When victims begin the long process of telling their story, it's only the beginning of what they may go through. It is during this time that they should know for certain that their stories matter, that their offenders are investigated, and those crimes are prosecuted with those offenders brought to justice. Last session, I became aware of the unacceptable backlog of rape kits that were languishing in our evidence rooms, denying justice. Denying justice for victims to get closure and perpetrators to be held accountable. With help from advocates such as yourselves, we were able to pass Act 164, which added further provisions to ensuring that rape kits are taken as a priority, and there is follow-through on this critical evidence. Thank you. But our work is not done. There are more steps to take. I've introduced a number of pieces of legislation aimed at protecting victims. Whether at trial or an evidentiary review or ensuring their rights are protected, legislation was drafted, passed through the Senate Judiciary Committee, and later the full Senate. I thank my colleagues, I thank Chairwoman Baker and Senate leadership for the understanding and foresight to get these bills passed. Among them was Senate Bill 399, which establishes the Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights. This bill models a national movement where victims of sexual assault deserve the right to have standard and understood rights across the country when it comes to their cases and how their evidence is being treated. As the bill was being prepared for a committee vote, we were able to gather additional input from a number of stakeholders in an attempt to take one final look at the rape kit process. I'm pleased to say that Senate Bill 399 passed with a comprehensive amendment that incorporates input from law enforcement, prosecutors, victims, and healthcare professionals to maximize our efforts and commitment to victims of sexual assault from all different angles. But we don't stop here. We don't stop advocating, talking, listening, or working together to address sexual assault and protect crime victims. I stand with you. I want to thank all of you again for being here and those who allow me the opportunity to stand with you and speak in support of all that you do to help our most vulnerable. The fight isn't over, but step by step, we can continue to work together to make this world safer for everyone. I look forward to helping accomplish that goal. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rachel Farrow, a Rape Crisis Center advocate and survivor. Rachel?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm here today to explain what it looks like, the reality of how sexual extortion affects all of the constituents and individuals here who live in Pennsylvania. My first encounter with sexual extortion didn't actually come, now that I work as an advocate at a rape crisis center with victims. It came when I was a student in a high school, similar to the ones that are in your communities, right here in our great state of PA. I was a 15-year-old girl who was just hoping to get her first job in a pretty large city with an amusement park in it. And I was hoping that I'd be able to get good old minimum wage. Now, at that time, one of the gatekeepers in order to get that job was individuals who had been there, supervisors, people who had been there longer than I had, to get a reference. And part of, the rite of passage, or so it was told to me at the time, was in order to get one of the older boys to give you a reference, you need to send them photos of yourself, lewd photos, photos that made me uncomfortable. Many of my peers told me at the time that this is just the way it worked. This is just what you did. It was a tit for tat, if you will, and you sent that photo in order to get gainful employment. So as a 15-year-old girl, much like the daughters, younger sisters, that you have in your life, I felt pressured in order to send a photo of myself, a photo that would possibly be able to get me prosecuted in order to get myself ahead. It made me feel guilty. It made me feel shamed. And it always, even to this day, hangs over my head like a dark cloud that there's photos of me as a juvenile, as a minor, something that myself I realized at the time I'm not alone in, something that I felt that I was told to me was just part of what needed to happen. As I got older, that guilt and shame, I was able to put a name on it. I was able to put a word to it, and that is sexual extortion. Extortion that I have seen now as an advocate countless times, not just with adults, but with juveniles. I work in the schools. I have gone back with my career here as an educator in multiple counties across our state, and I have talked with countless young adults and juveniles about their experience growing up. And I see many people holding up cell phones there. That cell phone has become a tool for digital extortion across ages, races, and walks of life. So many students right now are experiencing sexual extortion. They're being goaded into taking photos they are uncomfortable with, or blackmailed into taking more, or even into just straight up sexual assault and rape. I spoke recently with a high school senior who was in his tenure at school sexually extorted to send photos of himself to another student due to fear of being outed for his sexual orientation, something that kept him captive in his own person for many years and completely racked and destroyed his mental health. And I wish I could say that stories of his and stories like mine were alone. We need to really look as a state and look as a community and take a look at how we want to present the idea of our sanctity and take a stand against sexual extortion, because we cannot permit this to be okay, not for our children, not for our sisters, our mothers, our daughters, ourselves. We need to step up and say no more to sexual extortion. Thank you. And it is my privilege and honor to introduce Representative Nesbit.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for having me. I was, as part of my prepared remarks, I was going to explain what sexual extortion was in today's digital age, but I believe Rachel just summed it up much better than I could. But unfortunately, that's not an isolated incident, what she was describing. It's taking place all over the state of Pennsylvania. And right now, our laws do not adequately address this. Right now, extortion is described as some type of financial crime under Pennsylvania law. So we have to find a way to bring the current law to the technology. So I'm proud to introduce legislation along with Representative McClinton that would create a new type of crime that would call sexual extortion. And our legislation would help law enforcement and victim service organizations like all those that are present today to address this as a serious sex crime that right now is falling through the cracks. There's not a way to be charged. So our sexual extortion bill would do that. It would give law enforcement, police, and other officials a way to make sure that we crack down on this. But more importantly, I think today's event is bringing awareness to this issue. We need to educate people of what information they share and what they expose. Not only do we need to prosecute it, but we got to try to make sure that it doesn't happen in the first place. So this would be a way for us to actually bring the law up that we can use some of the digital technology to prosecute these crimes. So I want to thank Representative McClinton and her leadership. This is a bipartisan effort. We have a bipartisan event today, and I want to have a bipartisan success getting these bills passed through both the House and the Senate. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for having me, and I want to introduce Representative Joanne McClinton.
Thank you, Representative Nesbit. Good morning. Good morning. I'm State Rep Joanna McClinton. I have the distinct honor of serving the neighbors in the 191st Legislative District that includes communities in Southwest and West Philly, along with Delaware County. I'm here today because one time during all of the folks coming forward talking about being victimized, I had a conversation with my mother, and I talked to her about this issue. And she said, "Well, Joe, that's just the way it always was." I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She said, "Well, when you worked in a setting and you were at the bottom of the totem pole, you weren't in charge. If someone wanted to harass you, if somebody wanted to discriminate against you, if somebody wanted to say something in a sexual context that was totally inappropriate, that's just the way it always was." But today we're joined with all these great advocates to say that's not the way it's going to be any longer. It's not going to be like that any longer, where women especially, and of course children, are taken advantage of and abused, where they break up in a relationship and someone says, if you don't do this or you don't do that, I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z. We are not going to allow for sexual extortion to not be a law on Pennsylvania's books. We are here to take action, and we appreciate all of you coming back to the Capitol because we will be working until this gets across the finish line. Now, I have the distinct honor to welcome one of the leaders in the Pennsylvania Senate Democratic Caucus, who when I was just a young Senate staffer would always take such time to talk to me, encourage me, but most of all motivate me. Please welcome the gentlelady, Senator Judy Schwenk.
got a great team here, and I can't thank the advocates that are standing behind me. One thing I know I can count on, when I've been working on legislation in regards to sexual assault, domestic violence, there's an army of individuals, supporters of both PCAR, the Coalition Against Rape, as well as the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that are here because they've lived these experiences and they want to see it end. So thank you all, because you really are the wind behind our sails in trying to get this work done. It's truly appreciated. Sexual extortion, this is the bill that I share with Senator Ward over in the Senate, Senate Bill 337. Sexual extortion is a behavior that we see at all levels of society, affecting all kinds of people. It's a demeaning experience, and no man, woman, or child should have to endure to get housing or to get employed like Rachel was talking about, or just to live their lives. And it's time we treat it like the crime that it actually is. This is a long history. This goes way back in time. It's nothing new. But it's something that we just don't talk about. And you know why? Because it erodes a victim's self-respect. You feel less of a person to talk about this because you're saying, I subjected myself to being a victim. No, you did not subject yourself. You were made a victim by a criminal, and that criminal needs to be prosecuted. Here are some of the examples I can give you. Landlords withholding housing or repairs unless a person submits to sexual acts or provides sexual images. Landlords lowering your rent if you do this for them, if you provide them with sexual favors. Police officers lowering charges in exchange for sexual acts or images, or increasing charges if a person is not compliant. Employers withholding a client or promotion unless a person provides sexual acts or images, or promising a reward if a person actually does follow through on the behavior. Put yourself in the shoes of those victims. I know there are many of us here who have been subjected to this same kind of behavior. And once this relationship is established, it only continues, incurring more shame and destruction. Victims often experience negative physical, mental health, economic, and your reputation can be destroyed as well because of sexual extortion. Every survivor may be different, but they all feel alone, scared, and ashamed, and you don't think anybody will ever believe you. But today, we are moving forward both in the Pennsylvania House as well as the Senate to provide legislation that will make sextortion or sexual extortion the crime that it is. It will be a specific criminal offense with consequences similar to other sexual offenses. Again, I want to thank PCAR, who brought this legislation forward to me, and all of the women that talked to me about this issue when I said I was working on something like this, and the stories that I heard. It's shocking, and it only made me more resolved to make sure that we get something done to change this. It's not an easy topic to discuss, and it's not easy to come forward and say, I was a victim, but now you have some recourse. We've got to end this practice. So I thank everyone for being here today and for helping to support this. And I'm going to ask my colleague and friend, Senator Kim Ward, who is also a co-sponsor on this legislation. This is a bipartisan effort. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, and thank you for including me in this very, very important conference. I would like to also thank all of the advocates and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape for being here and for their tireless work to address the very real and very growing crime of sextortion. Sextortion is a serious crime, and it occurs when someone threatens to distribute your private and sensitive material if you don't provide them with images of a sexual nature, sexual favors, or money. Could you imagine that? Just imagine, if you will, being threatened into doing or performing some type of sexual activity by anyone, and at times even by someone you at one time trusted. That's just devastating. Or imagine a perpetrator threatening to harm your family or your friends or your relatives by using information they have obtained from an electronic device unless you comply with their demands. Without a doubt, sextortion is ruinous, and it has ruinous effects on its victims, many of whom are young. This is not a rich or a poor issue or crime. It's not a Democrat or Republican crime, as you can see by the bipartisan sponsorship of this bill. And I even see my own state rep standing here, Eric Nelson, this morning, who has 6 children. So I also want to add that Senator Schwank has just been a tireless advocate about this issue. The U.S. Department of Justice has identified sextortion as the fastest growing cyber threat to our children. Technology, through the use of cell phones, computers, tablets, they have enabled sexual predators and those who want to commit crimes on our children, they enable them to come right into our homes. Peer-to-peer coercion is now far too common among our kids. Just ask some of the middle and high school girls you know whether they've ever been asked to send an inappropriate picture to a classmate. And while it may be largely girls, it's also boys. And there are far too many cases where adults have been subjected to such demands in employment, housing, and even our justice system. But regardless of how old the victim is, the tactics used by the perpetrator or the motivation behind their act, the existing laws have failed too often in providing adequate prosecution. Victims have been left with fear and humiliation, but without justice. Senate Bill 337, if signed into law, will finally give victims that justice. I listened this morning to Senator Joe Scarnati at the Hunger Garden groundbreaking, and he spoke about the legislature and a moral responsibility to those who are hungry. And I thought immediately, that moral responsibility we have on many issues, and sextortion is definitely one of those issues. This crime affects people on such a personal level, and it's catastrophic. So I'm honored to be working with Senator Schwank and the House and the entire legislature and the governor's office to right this wrong. Thank you very, very much. And it is my distinct honor to introduce Secretary Rivera from the Pennsylvania Department of Education.
And I have the privilege to continue on the conversation, and as we know, this public conversation about combating sexual assault and harassment has been growing nationally. And the Wolf administration, along with our partners in the General Assembly, have sparked that conversation here in PA. First, when we introduced the It's On Us PA initiative in January of 2016, and now through support of Senate Bill 337. The initiative builds on the success of other initiatives introduced by national leaders, like former President Barack Obama, as well as leaders on this issue here in Pennsylvania. Leaders like the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, in addition to state and locally elected officials. The numbers are staggering. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men will experience some kind of sexual violence during their time in college, and some students are even more vulnerable. However, here in Pennsylvania, through the It's On Us PA campaign and continuing through legislation, the first state campaign of its kind, we have been empowering colleges and universities around PA to combat sexual violence with evidence-based programs aimed at preventing sexual assault. And now, through bipartisan support, we can continue to work to keep our students safe. Not every campus and community is the same, which is why school leaders, both faculty and students, are provided with the flexibility they need to implement the programs that will benefit their communities. Over the past 3 years, the state has driven nearly $3 billion to colleges and universities through the governor's It's On Us campaign program. And this funding have been invested in programs at 2- and 4-year institutions, public and private schools across the state. And through partnership, we will continue to provide opportunities for those communities. In turn, those schools have implemented programs to spark awareness about the issue, improve systems for reporting and responding, and to empower students to be the change agents in their own community. So while we advance this initiative and bolster the conversation on our campuses and in our communities and here at the Capitol, we need to continue to advocate for our students, not just those who have already been impacted by sexual violence, but also for our youngest students who one day will join campus communities. So we need to ensure that our communities and our campuses are safe for all students, and that there are systems in place to protect them. I thank you for allowing me to share in this opportunity and to share our regards. It is now my pleasure to introduce Frank Chardo, the Dauphin County District Attorney. Frank.
Hello, my name is Fran Chardo, and I have the privilege of serving as the District Attorney here in Dauphin County. And I also represent the District Attorneys Association statewide. I'm pleased to be here with our friends from the Pennsylvania Coalitions Against Rape and Domestic Violence. Together with those coalitions, we have worked on many critical pieces of legislation designed to protect victims of crime. In just the past few months, we have worked together on bills to improve our rape shield law and to help our most vulnerable victims have their testimony considered in court. Both the House and the Senate passed versions of these bills. By doing so, in both the House and the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats have shown a commitment to protecting the victims of crime. And we are just a few votes away from getting Marsy's Law onto the ballot this November. This is an important step to recognize the rights of victims. One major piece of legislation we are working on now has been mentioned repeatedly this morning. Again, in a bipartisan manner, we are attempting to create the crime of sexual extortion. Sexual extortion typically involves the threat to publish naked or sexually explicit images if the victim does not send more intimate images or perform sex acts. Our laws do not cover this type of extortion. Usually, extortion is only covered in the context of theft. And that's because our extortion law was written back in 1972, before the internet ever existed. Sextortion is a form of sexual exploitation and coercion, and often, but not always, involves children. Sexual extortion is so serious that in 2016, the Department of Justice reported that sextortion is by far the most significantly growing threat to children. Those who use dating websites are warned about it, and sadly, teenagers are particularly vulnerable to sextortion. What happens typically is perpetrators will manipulate social media to create a fake online presence to communicate with the victim. And after receiving intimate images or videos online, they will then sexually extort that victim to try to get them to give other sexual images, to require them to give it, or they will threaten to release those images. The other way they will do this is they will hack into someone's computer or their webcam to obtain images and then, again, attempt to extort that victim. These are two ways which our proposed legislation will make this specifically criminal. Our current law does not address this adequately, and it really can only be addressed marginally as some sort of harassment. Perpetrators often use their power to demand that the victim perform incredibly degrading and humiliating acts, and sometimes the victims are harmed such that they are driven to harm themselves physically. We need a specific offense to address this criminal conduct, and the proposed legislation does just that. We thank the prime sponsors of this legislation, Senators Judy Schwank and Kim Ward, and Representatives Ted Nesbit and Joanna McClinton. We also thank the Judiciary Chairs, Representative Kaufman and Senator Baker, for making these bills a top priority. On behalf of the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association, thank you to the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence for your partnership, and for everyone here for standing up and giving voice to the victims of crime. Thank you all. And now, I'd like to introduce one of our partners, Susan Higginbotham, the CEO of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Susan.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank all of the advocates and survivors who traveled to Harrisburg today to be a voice for all victims and survivors, as well as all of our legislators who have joined us to call attention to the issue of sexual extortion and the gaps in protective services for victims of sexual and domestic violence. I also want to thank Secretary Rivera for being here to bring awareness to the distressing fact that sexual and domestic violence is prevalent on college campuses, and for emphasizing the need for prevention as a keystone of secondary and post-secondary education. We know that girls and young women between the ages of 16 and 24 experience the highest rate of intimate partner violence, almost triple the national average, which is why PCADV and PCAR proudly support the It's On Us initiative. Today's speakers have underscored a cultural shift in how these types of sexual and domestic violence crimes are perpetrated, as well as what our collective response is as a society. We continue to be encouraged that we've entered an era where more survivors feel empowered to come forward, to get help, and to seek justice. Yet, as the movement evolves, our response also needs to change. As you've heard from our speakers, and as the advocates here today have been sharing in their meetings with legislators, delivering needed quality services to victims and survivors continues to become more complex, and the range of services needed is much broader, which ultimately widens the gap of unmet needs. As the state's coalitions charged with working to end sexual and domestic violence in Pennsylvania, our collective goal is to remove barriers to access to services and to make free, confidential, and comprehensive services available to all victims and survivors. We do this by leveraging a dedicated network of advocates, like the people standing behind me who inspire me every day, and the stakeholders who push for necessary policy changes to help Pennsylvania. Yet this goal cannot be accomplished without adequate funding to enable us to respond to and to prepare for an ever-changing system of service needs and delivery. We ask for your support of and advocacy for our request for a 10% increase to the domestic violence and sexual assault service line items in the state budget. That would amount to a collective total of $2.7 million, which I think is something that we can really invest in. Funding increases are critical to sustaining services and retaining the dedicated advocates, many of whom who are here today, who work directly with survivors each day to ensure that they get the help that they need to rebuild and restore their lives free of violence. Pennsylvania's citizens are depending on us. Thank you all very much.